And thank you to Daryl and Victoria and Izzy and everybody who helped organize this event, and all of the various institutional organizations involved. Yeah, I want to answer three questions that all have to deal with our ethical obligations to future generations. And I want to begin with a broad overview of what we know about whether people care about the future at all, and if so, how much. Then I'll turn to a recent set of findings that ask a more specific question: how far into the future do people think our moral responsibility ought to extend? So this one gets at how people think about normative intergenerational ethics. And then finally, I want to talk about the things that we've tried that can get people to care about the future more. I'm going to talk about a lot of empirical findings, hopefully, in the time we have. But before I get there, I want to take a step back and then put up a few normative arguments just for us to frame where the talk is going. And I want us to consider two perspectives that have risen to the forefront of the popular imagination surrounding the ethics of caring for future generations. And both of these, I think, are on their face somewhat plausible. And the first is what I call the weak long-termist perspective, and it has three premises. Future people matter. There could be a lot of them. There are things we could do to make their lives better. And like all normative ethical arguments, it has a conclusion, and it's that if we accept these three premises, then we have an obligation to protect the well-being of future generations by mitigating forward-facing risks like climate change, future pandemics, and potentially dangerous emerging technologies like AI. The other perspective I want to consider is a little bit different, and it's the view that long-termism is a philosophy against the present. And the premise is that we invest in caring about the future, and to the extent that we do, the more we're sidelining efforts to address challenges that humanity is already facing, like global poverty, inequality, and social justice. And then a fairly sound conclusion from this premise is that if caring for the present and future are inherently at odds, then maybe we should leave future challenges to future people and just focus on the present now. Which, again, I think is somewhat plausible. I'm a scientist, so I'm not going to make a strong normative argument for either of these perspectives, but in the context of moral fragmentation, I think some of the data that I'll present pushes back on the idea that caring about the present and caring about the future are inherently zero-sum. These are two types of concerns that don't necessarily have to be fragmented, at least psychologically, in that they both can coexist within the same mind. So to ground where we're headed, I'm going to make a broad and possibly optimistic statement that guides a lot, maybe all of the research that I do. The nature of altruism is changing. Thanks to advancements in technology, medicine, and economics, we can save more lives with fewer resources and less effort than ever before. On a less optimistic note, our capacity for altruism often goes underused. And I'm not suggesting that people aren't helping enough. It's just that we're really quick to help those who are close to us, but we rarely extend that same generosity to distant strangers. And that's even when doing so could save more people or potentially do more good. And this is a tension that I see as something that matters because a lot of the greatest challenges that face humanity today, like preventable disease, global poverty, social justice issues too, and some of the worst health impacts of climate change mostly affect people who are farther away and whose suffering can feel abstract precisely because of that distance. But as we look to the future, that pattern continues. So emerging risks like misaligned artificial intelligence, future pandemics, and the eventual collapse of our climate will shape the lives of generations to come in one way or another. And there are things we can do now, like individual level action and passing regulatory policy that can help mitigate these future challenges. There's been a gap in our knowledge until recently, though, because a lot of work has sought to understand and overcome the social biases that constrain altruistic behavior in the present. So these are the biases that make us care more for family members and friends and in-groups than we do for out-groups and entities in the natural world, like plants and animals. But where in people's circles of moral consideration do future generations lie? Do we feel less obligated to help and protect the welfare of those in future generations than people in the present? And does our concern for future generations diminish as they get farther away in time? So in some of my recent work, my research team and I set out to address the levels of concern people in the present feel for people in the future. And we've been using this moral circle setup that I would imagine some of you are at least conceptually familiar with, to measure how much concern people feel for all these different entities of varying levels of distance from the self. So participants see a diagram like this one. It's themselves at the center, that little person there, and then these concentric circles surrounding the self. And they're told that the innermost circle is reserved for the entities with the greatest moral standing. These are the ones that they feel the strongest obligations to care for and protect. And then each circle moving outward reflects a lower level of obligation or standing. And participants place a range of entities into these different moral boundaries based on how much concern they feel. So they place their present day in-groups, like family members, their friends, their close acquaintances. Present day out-groups, like out-partisans, people with different religious beliefs, stigmatized individuals. And then finally, entities in the natural world, like dolphins, bees, and coral reefs, old-growth forests, the Grand Canyon, entities in nature. We did an integrative analysis across all the data sets we had from this type of task. And the most consistent finding, and this is consistent with all of the prior research, is that people place in-groups like family and close friends close to the center of their moral circles, closer than they place out-groups, which are down in that bottom corner. And nature. So people feel a stronger moral obligation to help and protect those who are socially closer than those who are socially distant. These are all present-day entities, but we also included intergenerational targets. So this let us examine in that integrative analysis where future generations are placed relative to present-day outgroups. They are people who won't be born for at least 100 years. So where do they fall? Well, there are a few possibilities. On one hand, people have less reason to feel hostility towards future generations, at least than towards some groups in the present. But on the other hand, future generations are distant in all these special ways that often reduce concern for targets in the present. So where do they fall? Well, we find that future generations fall farther from the center of the moral circle than all other targets in the present, even farther than these groups in the present, outgroups, nature, that people consistently fail to help and care for. So future generations hold the lowest moral standing. We were also interested in what it is about future generations that makes them so damn hard to care about, and one possible explanation is that it has something to do with their psychological distance, how far away from us their needs and lives feel. So in other work, we set out to answer this question of whether the tendency to devalue future generations becomes stronger as future generations become farther away in time, and the logic is if they're farther away in time, maybe they feel farther away from us in their minds. So we asked people how much moral obligation they felt for future generations compared to the amount of obligation they felt towards entities in the present day. And what we varied was how far into the future those generations were said to live. What we found is that obligation declines as future generations are placed farther away from the present. So the more temporally distant people seem, the less responsible people feel for protecting their well-being. We found the same exact pattern for pro-social behavior using an intergenerational discounting task. As the beneficiaries of future-focused charities are depicted farther away in time, people become less generous towards the future, and they prefer giving progressively smaller endowments to alternative present-focused charities when the future beneficiary is placed farther away in time. We were also interested in getting at the potential psychological underpinnings of why this might be. So we measured people's efficacy over influencing future outcomes. How much do you believe you could steer the future to a better course? And people's reported ability to visualize future generations. How clearly can you imagine the future? And what we found is that in a similar fashion to obligation and pro-social behavior, people report feeling less confident that they can shape the future when it feels farther away in time. And as people try to picture the individuals who will live in that future, their subjective ability to do so clearly diminishes as they get farther away. And both of these seem to matter for obligation and prosociality. When people feel less able to make a positive difference in the future, they feel less responsible for protecting it. And the same is true for when people find it hard to picture future generations clearly. So future generations hold the lowest moral standing. Obligation and prosociality are more constrained for distal relative to proximal future targets. And people find it hard to visualize the future. They feel less efficacy over positively impacting the future. And both of these things help to explain our declines in obligation and prosociality over time. So these findings suggest collectively that our capacity for future-oriented altruism is largely underused, not necessarily because of technological limitations, but perhaps psychological limitations. So this research invokes a critical question, and it's that if the challenges of tomorrow are ethically meaningful and we think that they're worth mitigating, are we in trouble? And or to put it less formally, is human psychology necessarily poorly equipped for caring about the challenges of a distant tomorrow? I don't think so. So in the research that I just talked about, we assessed attitudes towards the future in these trade-off scenarios where thriving in the future was presented as coming at the expense of thriving in the present. Like, how much do you care about future generations relative to all these entities of the present? It's methodologically important because a lot of the critiques of future-oriented policy highlight material present-day costs. But when future-oriented action isn't presented as a trade-off, and when it's presented as part of living like a meaningful or flourishing life now, like in our data, we see that it's not nearly as aversive. So for one, we developed and validated this simple 7-item measure that's like a total mouthful. We call it the Impartial Intergenerational Beneficence Inventory, or the IIBI for short, which is much easier to say. And the goal is to capture how much people care about future generations, but also how much that concern fades across time. So it's 7 items, but participants respond to each of them for 4 different time frames, each progressively more distant from the present. So 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, and 1,000,000 years. And like I've gotten comments about this, that like asking people to consider how much you care for people that far away in time is like asking people how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But people do show quite a bit of variability across those time frames, and that variability does explain like consequential behaviors. So we've run like a number of studies using this with over 50,000 subjects from people from every habitable continent. It performs well psychometrically, but across all of these studies, the most interesting thing to me is that a surprising number of people, about 1 in 4, don't show this typical present bias. And they care about people in the far future just as much as they care about people closer to the present. We've been referring to these people, the ones who score like that blue line on the graph there, as people who endorse the ethical principle of impartial intergenerational beneficence. Again, the same mouthful as before. This is IIB. These are the people who score like this blue line. They don't diminish in concern as people get farther away in time. They feel strong concern for future generations, and it doesn't seem to weaken across time. That's about 25% of people. And people who report caring about the future in that impartial pattern are more willing to donate to future-oriented causes. They're better at imagining the future. They feel greater concern for future-oriented threats like AI, like climate change. They're more likely to support forward-looking policy. They cope with stress related to issues like climate change in a problem-focused versus like avoidant manner. They even judge others who help future generations more positively. So in other words, there are some people who extend a genuine moral concern, not just across spatial boundaries, but also, it seems, across temporal boundaries. But what I think is the absolute coolest thing about these people is that rather than coming at the cost of caring about the present, these future-focused individuals care more about the present rather than less, relative to those who care about the future less. They care more about present-day outgroups. So they care more about justice issues. They care more about the natural environment, not just in the future, but now. And they care no less for those who are socially close, like their family members and friends, in doing so. And we've shown this not just in like moral circle tests where you have this boundless amount of concern. I can technically place everybody at the center of my moral circle. We also did it where it's like you have 100 points to allocate to all these like 30 different targets. and these 4 future generations, and the people who care more about those future generations don't diminish how much concern they feel for their in-groups to a significant extent, and they assign greater points to all these other present-day actors too. So I think that's really cool. So do people care about the societal future at all? I think the answer is a qualified yes, and it's especially true when the future and present aren't framed as a trade-off. And what's especially promising to me, given that second normative argument I put up, that presentist perspective, is that it doesn't seem that the people who do care the most about the future behave like it's a trade-off. They actually care more about the present than their peers who care less about the future. So I want to talk about these 2 questions in our time remaining. First, when we don't explicitly frame the present and future as a trade-off, how far into the future do people think our responsibility to future generations ought to extend, and then how can we get people to care more? Not necessarily saying that we should, but how have we looked at ways that we can get people in that direction, which helps us answer things about mechanisms, about what might be a limiting concern for distant temporal others. We went after this first question in a paper that was recently published in SciRep, and it was we were interested in the principle of 7th generation stewardship, which is often attributed to the political and spiritual knowledge systems of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a group of indigenous tribes in the northeastern United States. And the basic idea is that decisions made today, whether they're made by individuals or by governments, should be made with the well-being of the next 7 generations in mind. This more broadly reflects a view of human life as deeply interconnected across time, where the past, the present, and the future are not isolated from one another. And obviously, indigenous traditions are really diverse across the world. But a lot of these knowledge systems have shared commitments to relationality, to stewardship, and responsibility across generations in various ways. Our interest was to just understand how the typical American feels about this principle. We wanted to know how many future generations the average adult in the U.S. believes that individuals and governments should keep in mind when making decisions that could impact the future. Study 1 was really simple. We just recruited 600 American adults online in a nationally representative sample, and we asked them how many future generations should individuals have in mind when they make collective decisions. So these are just decisions that individuals make that could have some kind of collective consequences. Each generation was the number of people born in a 25-year period. So generation 1 is like people born 25 years from now, and 50, and so on. How does that compare to 7? Well, the majority of Americans said that individuals should think about at least 11 generations ahead when their decisions can have societal consequences. So about 275 years. As we talked about yesterday, individual decisions do matter. And policy is one of the greatest tools we can have for making sure that we can safeguard the future on a societal scale. So our second study had the same setup as the first. This time we just asked, how many generations should governments keep in mind when making decisions about policy? Similar to our first study, on average, the majority of Americans said that governments should think about at least 9 generations ahead when writing policies, about 225 years. So these findings are pretty cool because they suggest that people care quite a bit more about the future than maybe I would have imagined based on our earlier data, and maybe than you would too. So if you recall, in the past we found that future generations hold the lowest moral standing in the moral circle, even lower than present-day outgroups and stigmatized entities that people often feel little concern for. They were placed nowhere close to the center, but more closer to the fringes of the moral boundary. So why are we finding now that people actually think future generations should factor into individual and governmental decisions, even when they're somewhat far away from the present? One reason might be that people don't think about these questions naturalistically in a trade-off context, where the present and future come into contrast with each other. And in our earlier studies, people place future generations in their moral circle alongside all these present-day entities, including their close family and friends. So they were thinking relativistically, inherently, how much do I care about people 1,000 years from now relative to how much I care about my best friend or my own mother? In the present investigation, we wanted to see how far people's future moral boundaries extended when they aren't prompted to think about these present-day entities. So we used the same moral circle setup. The only difference is that here, participants weren't placing in-groups. They were only placing and out-groups, no present-day entities. It was just future generations. people born 1 year from the present, all the way to 1,250 years from the present. They placed them into those different moral boundaries. And what we wanted to figure out was the average transition point where participants tended to no longer include future generations within their moral circle at all. So to figure that out, we calculated for every person the generation at which their moral concern dropped all the way to 0, when they said, these people are no longer inside my moral boundary whatsoever. On average, people reported feeling at least some concern for 28 generations. 700 generations of people fall within the boundaries of the average person's moral circle. So how far do people think we should care? For at least for Americans on prolific, roughly 11 generations for individuals, about 9 for governments, and people feel some level of moral concern for about 28 generations before feeling none at all beyond that point. So people think we ought to care about future generations, and knowing that, we've been interested in testing ways that we could get people to do it. And we've done it in a few ways. Some simple rational appeals rooted in long-termist philosophy get people to donate more money to future-focused charities. They invest more cognitive effort raising money for forward-looking causes. Making people work through some more elaborative philosophical thought experiments gets them to support future-focused and pro-environmental policies. We also found that at baseline, Americans tend to drastically underestimate how much their peers support future-focused policies. Like by a whole lot. The little black diamonds up there are the actual levels of support. The ones down the bottom there for Republicans and Democrats and how much they think the average American supports each of these policies. Huge gap. But just correcting those misperceptions boosts people's own levels of support and corrects the misperceptions, even though support was already generally high. We're developing new ones where one I think is pretty cool is this chatbot that simulates what it would be like to have a conversation with your future grandchild. And our early results from this are quite promising. We're doing this in collaboration with Falk Leader in his lab at UCLA. And it's led by a really impressive undergrad, and it's really cool stuff. So is human psychology necessarily poorly equipped for caring about the future? I think the answer is not really. We probably just need a little push. Our capacity for future-oriented altruism does largely go underused, but humans are mental time travelers. We've been gifted with this capacity to transcend the present in our mind's eye. We can remember our past, imagine our futures, and we do it every day when we learn from our experiences, when we plan for what's to come. And the data are showing that the same cognitive capacities that help us plan for ourselves might be able to help us plan for the future of society. I don't advance a normative argument that humans are inherently obligated to protect the welfare of future generations. I do think humans on average think that we should care about future generations, and maybe that this should be reflected in our current policies. And resources like time and money are inherently limited, but care and concern doesn't seem to be, and our data are showing that caring about the future and caring about the present don't seem to be at odds. So to close out, the nature of altruism is changing. We have the capacity to do more good than ever before, even across generations. So in addition to building out research on boring theory, which is a thing I really love to do, but I don't put a lot in my talks. Part of my goal in science is to get people to use this capacity to a greater extent. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you to these guys here who have made this work possible in a number of ways. That's Steos, my advisor at ASU, and we were postdocs together at Boston College. That's Jin Capizzoli, his grad student, Leanne Young, who's the greatest mentor that I'll ever have, which makes this next one awkward. Bren's great too. He was my grad advisor. And then Paige, who you all know is my best friend and favorite person to work with. I'm Kyle. I'll be starting in July as the director of the Morality, Altruism, and Pro-Sociality Lab at the University of Utah. Thank you so much for listening to me.
All right, I think like 5 minutes for questions.
Sweet. Yeah.
My question is from the JDM perspective, so it's about numbers and
Yeah.
presentation and framing. So I noticed that in the way that you ask participants, you give them the maximal information. So 25 years is one generation.
Mm-hmm.
And from a JDM perspective, how you present the numbers can make a difference.
Right.
So I'm wondering, do you
Yeah.
think there will be a difference if you just tell people 1 generation, 2 generations? In fact, they will say more generations than if you directly give them, say, 250 years. And will they also evaluate the information differently if you tell them By the way, our forefathers, 250 years ago, 1776,
Yeah.
exactly 250 years ago, right? Made these decisions that still affect us today.
Yeah.
Will
That's
that
right.
also
That's
shift
very good.
us through?
Yeah, so there are a few things in there. One is like, no, we didn't do that first thing you said, and it's something I've been interested in doing. And like another thing I've been interested in doing is just having them like drag on a slider scale, like how far into the future in years, and trying to see how many different ways we can cut it up, and just doing a really like boring methods paper that would be also like interesting and yield insights. Like if we present it in these different ways, yeah, maybe people are more likely to move that needle differently. But also that might predict support for policies as a framing itself, where you're getting people to like reconstrue their temporal distance from the future. Another idea that like in this particular study, we didn't do an intervention like that, where we talked about like relationality across time, where it's like, yeah, like actually like we have what we have now because of these past sacrifices and forefathers came before us, and we wouldn't have anything that we do now without the sacrifices they made presented like that. There are also there's a more complex story there. Yeah.
It could go the other way,
Yeah.
right? Where they
Yeah.
think, I don't know these forefathers.
Yeah, right.
250 years is actually a really long time, so I shouldn't care about
Yeah, sure.
whatever it is at 250.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah, it's an empirical question, and I'd be interested in seeing what would happen. I do think people like construe their obligations towards future generations sometimes, where it's like, well, these people are far in the future, and unlike every other like case of human cooperation, there's no expectation that they're going to be able to pay me back. But something I think asking people to look backwards might do is say, well, maybe I'm not in the looking to be paid back phase, but maybe in the paying back phase, and that now I need to be the one who's stewarding forward the sacrifices that have been made for me and made my existence now possible. So like I could see like alternative hypotheses for what that would do, and I think that's a really great idea. It's something I'd be interested in going after empirically. But thank you. Yeah. All right, and then I'll go to you. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about childless cat ladies.
Oh yeah, please.
Because the logic behind that insult is that they don't have a connection.
Interesting.
And if you look at the language in the civil rights movements, back to Du Bois and others, they're talking about the future of my group
Yeah, right.
as opposed to the future of people in general.
Yeah. This is, yeah. So Tricia Shroom has done a lot of work on what she calls the green parenthood effect, where like people who have children are more likely to care about climate change because this is something that's going to impact their own descendants. There is a correlation and it's positive, but it's not super strong. So, but we've done like a lot of work that shows we've looked at parenthood and the relationship isn't that strong. We've also like asked people like, do you want to have children? And this does like have a positive association with how much people express concern for future generations. But for people who don't, like the concern can like there is quite a bit of variability. Some people care a lot, some people care a little. So I think it matters. Something I've been finding, not just in my intergenerational work, but across data I've been collecting, is that there are people who construe their group differently, and the more people care about their group consistently predicts how much they care about like obligations to family and obligations to close others. But I'm finding that if people construe their group more broadly and include more distant others in their social identity, they're also more likely to extend concern to entities beyond those who are close.
And there are measurements actually of the extent to which your sense of self is integrated into other people.
Yeah, we've used the allo-inclusive identity scale and like the Aaron's inclusion of other itself, the overlapping circles measuring. Like if you do that to a greater extent with more distant others, like
Does it have an effect?
Yeah, and we find that even things like group loyalty wind up predicting concern for distant others, which is something I never would have expected, but I think it makes sense if you have a really wide conceptualization of what your group is.
Right.
You consider all these people as being in the same boat as you. Well, nobody wants to sink their own boat. Yeah. Yeah.
So actually building on that question, that was part of my question, but building on it, I wonder if, you might push back against people's idea that the further out, the less concern they have. Because, right now I have one daughter, but maybe in 25 years I'd have, 4 grandchildren, and 7 generations, there'd be thousands of people. So have you thought of like priming people to think like the further you get, the more descendants you're going
This
to
is a
have?
really great question. So
This is Abraham,
Yeah.
like the stars.
I'm in the School of Sustainability at ASU, but I spend a lot of time, we caucus with the psych department, and it's a really evolutionary heavy psych department, and they're like, well, one thing you got to keep in mind is that, your genetic relatedness to future generations is going to deteriorate every generation, so I've been like, okay, well, let's do a study where we look at people in the present, and it's like, okay, you have I don't know, you share 50% of your genes with your parents and 25% with siblings, so on. Well, we could do that with future generations and try to find matched pairings for each one of those. But and I've always thought about doing that with one person now, one person in the future. Study 2 would be, okay, but now you have also increasing geometrically is the number of people that share that genetic relatedness, and maybe that combines with that could get people to care more. I like this idea, and yeah.
I just have a quick aside. I'm wondering, it's just I think my own conversations, people seem to care less about the future because there are assumptions that technology in the future is going to rescue us, and I wonder if you might again explore how much of that is informing people's thoughts and perhaps push back against it too.
We've done a lot of intervention work where people write open-ended responses, and we're currently doing thematic analysis of it, and there's this one cohort of people that are just this is a problem for them, and they're going to be better equipped. They're going to know what the problems are, and I have work showing that certainty matters, where it's the more I feel certain that I can actually figure out what the problem is and solve it, the more likely I am to actually invest resources, whether they're time or money, into solving it. The interesting thing I'm finding is that people care more about certainty and weight it more heavily for future relative to present others. So even if I can save the same number of people or even a greater number of people in the future with greater certainty, I'm more likely to choose a less certain cause in the present that saves a smaller number of lives. So certainty matters, and I think it's we're seeing that it matters more for the future, and I think the texts that are lining up with this, that there is this group of people that just is we don't even know what those problems will be. I don't even know if the world will exist in 100 years. I don't know if anything I could do could influence it, let alone positively. And they're at least based on what we're seeing when people free respond to these prompts, that matters to quite a few people. So that's a spot on observation. Yeah, this is a thing that matters psychologically. I don't know if we have any more time.
If you have more questions, this is a fascinating presentation.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. We probably should move on to our next speaker, but thank you.
Thank you.